Hello again and welcome back to our course on SharePoint Foundation 2013. In this section we're going to start to look at libraries and lists. Now it's very important to understand first of all the difference between a library and list, and although many features of how we use them and look after them are the same, there are also very significant differences. So let's start with an explanation of what a list is and what a library is. Now sometimes when people start thinking of a list, they think of something like a shopping list. So a list of single items, bread and milk and cheese and so on. But in fact it would be more accurate in relation to SharePoint to think of a list as a spreadsheet. So basically the rows of the spreadsheet are the items in the list and the columns are the individual attributes, the columns in the list. And a list will normally be a list of items with many attributes. You could also think of it really as a table. Now within SharePoint 2013, not only does it handle lists very well, but it has built into it many facilities for maintaining lists and for viewing and customizing them. So lists really are one of the cornerstones of SharePoint 2013. A library, on the other hand, is a list of files. So you still have the list element, but in this case the things that are listed are files. And these files can be just about any sort of file. Very often on this course we'll be referring to Microsoft Office files, things like Word documents. And again, within SharePoint 2013 there are some very good facilities for managing Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, etc. And these includes things like being able to view them, being able to do version control, and in an increasing way over the various versions of SharePoint that have come along, integration between Microsoft Office and SharePoint has increased. And as you'll see later on in the course, some of the facilities that you can use now for integration are very impressive indeed. Now one word of warning I would give you here when it comes to talking about Office documents is that you need a more recent version of Microsoft Office to take full advantage of the facilities in SharePoint 2013. But older versions, particularly 2010 of Microsoft Office, have good integration, and even versions before that can use some of the features that are now in SharePoint 2013. But I'll give you a lot more detail about those things, and we'll have plenty of examples of those later on in the course. SharePoint 2013 comes with a number of default lists built in, and in fact the announcements that we set up a little while ago is an example of a list of announcements. To look at the other ones that are available by default in SharePoint 2013, if you go to Site Contents and click on Add an App, and then within Find an App you actually type list and hit the search button, you'll see the available lists. Now there are quite a few here, some of which, for instance contacts, you can probably pretty much work out what that is. One or two of the others, such as survey, we'll look at later on. But for the purposes of this first exercise, we're going to create an issue tracking list. Now this will be used by our team to resolve the issues that we have in working out our general approach to managing projects. So let's select issue tracking. Now we need to give our issue tracking list a name. We can of course have more than one of these within a site structure. So this one is to do with our project management standards. And the list is created, and as you'd expect it appears now within our site contents list. Now the first thing I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about what this list consists of. And if you look at the list in the site contents on our site, you'll see if you hover over the text to the right of the issue tracking icon, a little ellipsis symbol, 3 dots. Click on the 3 dots and you see that PM Standards, the name of the list, comes up. And then you have three options: settings, about, and remove. Remove is the command that we'll use to remove the list, and in fact we're going to remove this list and start again in just a moment. But if you click on about, you'll see that it gives you some information about that particular type of list, an issue tracking list, and then if you wanted to add it, you've got an add it button there. Let me just go back. If we look at the settings for this list though, we'll see that there are actually, even for a relatively straightforward list like this, there are many settings. I'm going to talk about what's at the top here in just a moment, but let me just scroll down a little way. The columns in this list, so if you think of this as a spreadsheet, each row is one of these tasks in the list, but these are the columns, these are the attributes of each task. A title, modified date and time, created date and time, assigned to. If we're going to assign this task to a person, the person or group it's assigned to, and so on. Now, as you'll see below that, we have the options to create columns, we can change the order of the columns, we can index the columns, and we're going to look at all of these features later on in the course. We then have our standard view options. How would you like to look at this view? We've got a default view, a mobile view, a default mobile view, and as you can see right down at the bottom there, we have the option to create our own view of this list. So there are plenty more things for us to find out about later on in relation to lists. Now let's go back up to the top here, and many of these settings relate specifically to the whole list rather than the individual items within the list. So we have versioning settings, advanced settings, validation settings. We have an option here to delete the list, to save the list as a template. So if we set this up in a way that we think we might use elsewhere, we can save it as a template for this sort of list. We can set the permissions for this list and establish the workflow settings. We can also look at RSS settings. That's one for later as well. But what I want to draw your attention to now is right at the top for PM standards. The list has a name, PM standards, and it has a web address. Now, one of the problems here, which is actually get roundable, but is something that we like to avoid, is that when it makes the web address, it uses the name that you've entered as part of the web address. So this web address has got a space in it, PM standards. And in fact, a better bet when you're creating lists is to give them web address type names with no spaces, and in fact I tend to always go for lowercase as well. And then you can actually change the list name to something more meaningful using, for example, this option, list name, description and navigation. So what I'm going to do now is to delete this list and do what we did just now again. So I'm going to click on delete this list. I could have used that remove option that we saw against the list in the site contents display, but let's click on delete this list. Get a confirmation question, click on OK. Note that it'll only be going to the recycle bin anyway, so we could get it back if we needed to. And now this list is deleted. Now let me just go through adding it again. Now this time when I'm adding my issue tracking list, I'm going to call it PM standards. And the other thing about a list name is that it's always a good idea to give it a very meaningful name without being too wordy. Now, PM standards sounds like a list of our PM standards, whereas in fact it's going to be our issue list. It's the things we need to do on our list. So I'm going to call it PM standards to do. Bit of a long, unwieldy looking name, but don't worry about that. Click on create. And there is our list. Now let me go into the settings, click on list name, description and navigation, and I'm going to change what we'll refer to as the display name to a much more helpful version. Now I'm also going to enter a description. There's a description. Now, do I want to display this list on the quick launch? Well, I'm going to say no for now. You notice it appears under recent, but it isn't independently on the quick launch. I'm going to stick with no because I'm going to have a view for that list instead a little bit later on. So let me now click on save. and there is my list. Now of course when I go back to site content, so for instance if I click now on site contents, it would appear there with that nice display name of PM Standards To Do. But if I look at the web address, you can see it's got that rather unwieldy but space-free and no capital letters name, PM Standards To Do, which is how I like to do things, and it may well be how you like to do things as well. So that's pretty good. We've got two lists now. We have our announcements list and we have our PM Standards To Do list. Let's take a look at PM Standards To Do. We'll just click on it. Of course we don't see the settings, we see the list itself, and at the moment the list is of course empty because I haven't added any to-do items yet. And the next thing I'm going to do is to add an item to this list. Now one thing to point out here is that we're seeing a default view of this list, and I went through some of the columns in the list just now with you. There were many more columns than are shown here. When you put together a view, you will normally select which columns you want to include and what order they're in, and certain other features which we're going to come back to later when we look at views in detail. But let's begin now just by putting our first item into the list. So the most straightforward way of adding an item to this list will be to click on the plus button there, add a new item to the list or library, and that brings up a view that is used for doing addition of items to this list. Now apart from the views which we use to actually look at the items in the list, we have views associated with maintenance, such as this view that we're going to use to add an item to the list. Now I'm going to at the moment add a couple of items which are for me to work on, and then I'll add items for some of my colleagues a bit later on. So let me add the first item. Then I choose who to assign it to. That's me. Notice that once it recognizes part of my name, it'll let me choose from the list. The issue status is active. The priority is normal. Now I'm going to enter a description. Now I can use categories within my list. At the moment the categories are numbered 1 to 3, and I'm going to call this category 1. I'll talk more about categories later on. I can also specify any other issues that are related to this one. Now at the moment this is the first issue that I've added, so there won't be anything related to it. And I'm going to set a due date of the end of January. So that's Friday, January 31st at, let's say, 9 AM. So there we are, there's the first item. Note the ribbon up here. Apart from the cut, copy and paste facilities, I can also attach a file. But having entered those details, no comments, click on Save. And there's my first list item in the default view. Now just bear with me for a moment while I create another one. So there is the second item in the PM Standards To Do list. Now I should point out here that I'm not dwelling on an awful lot of detail at the moment. We are going to come back to the detail later, but I want to get a bit more content in place first. But as you can see, a couple of interesting features here. One of them is that as I add the items to this list, they are automatically numbered. The issue ID is actually assigned by SharePoint itself. I don't need to keep track of those numbers. And also, if you look at the heading of each of the displayed columns, let's take issue status for example. At the moment, if I click on the drop down there, what you'll see are a couple of useful features. One of them is that I can sort on issue status, ascending or descending, which can be very useful if I'm dealing with a long list. And I can also filter which issue status values I want to show. Now at the moment both of these issues are active, so the only option that shows here is the active option. So let me just close there. Similarly on priority, I could choose, in this case I've got high priorities and normal priorities. If I were to check high and close, I would only see the high priority items in the list, and the little filter symbol there reminds me that the list is currently filtered. If I want to clear the filter, then I can go back and say clear filters from priority, and then I'll be back at the full list again. So you can already begin to see how powerful and useful these different views can be. But we've made a start on this particular list. We're going to come back to it a little bit later on. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.